Hey guys, and welcome back to the only channel where historical accuracy gets aggressively spoon-fed to your subconscious until you're blissfully dreaming of ancient tax codes. Tonight, we're tackling someone with more issues than your Wi-Fi router during a firmware update, the legendary Hercules. That's right, the big guy, the original muscle-bound influencer, before protein powder was even a twinkle in a caveman's eye. We're going through his entire chaotic, often regrettable life story, from conception to apotheosis, in painstaking, sleep-inducing detail. But only if you actually enjoy this, of course. No pressure, just a gentle nudge towards that subscribe button if you find yourself drifting off into a world where gods behave worse than reality TV stars. So, go ahead and get comfy. Adjust your pillows. Fluff that duvet. Maybe put on your fuzziest socks, the ones with the questionable stains you tell yourself are just coffee. But deep down, you know better. We're about to embark on a journey through ancient Greece, a land where divine intervention was as common as a traffic jam. And your biggest problem wasn't your boss, but whether Zeus was going to turn into a swan and mess up your afternoon. Ever wonder if Hercules had a decent gym membership? Or what kind of protein shake he drank after wrestling a lion? Did he have a favorite Lululemon outfit for his monster slaying? What was his Spotify playlist like? Was it all angry gods and battle anthems? Or did he secretly vibe with some ancient Greek chill hop? We're going to dive into the nitty-gritty, the stuff they don't teach you in primary school, because frankly, it's far too boring for anyone to stay awake through, which, coincidentally, is our entire business model. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Greece. The air is thick with the scent of olives, sea salt, and impending divine drama. You hear the distant bleating of goats and, disturbingly, what sounds like a god complaining about slow Wi-Fi. You glance down and realize you've accidentally spilled wine on Hera's favorite tunic. Bad start. Very bad start. But don't worry. You're just here to observe the life of a demigod who had it far worse. Trust me. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin with a truly baffling story of how our hero even came to be. Let's talk about how you, Hercules, came to be. Your dad, Zeus, had a bit of a reputation, much like that one relative who always shows up uninvited to Thanksgiving. In this case, he showed up disguised as your mum's husband, Amphitryon, while the actual Amphitryon was off fighting a war. It was a classic, honey, I'm home, but I'm actually a god situation, stretched out for 3 consecutive nights. Imagine your surprise when the real husband returned, only to find his wife already very pregnant and quite confused. It was definitely a situation that would require some extensive and probably awkward family therapy sessions. To truly appreciate the absurdity of your origin story, you have to picture the scene. Thebes, your future hometown, is quiet. The oil lamps cast long, flickering shadows across cool stone floors. The air, usually thick with the sounds of merchants and chariots, is now still, carrying only the scent of night-blooming jasmine and distant olive groves. Your mother, Alcmene, a woman of legendary beauty and a descendant of the hero Perseus, is waiting for her husband's return. She believes him to be a great man, a general, a hero in his own right. She has no idea she's about to be visited by the divine equivalent of an elaborate catfish scheme perpetrated by the king of the gods himself. Zeus didn't just pick her name out of a hat. He was specifically targeting her noble bloodline, hoping to sire a son who would be a champion for both gods and mortals. It was less a romantic gesture and more a calculated celestial breeding program. Zeus, ever the master of dramatic entrances, didn't just knock on the door. He descended from Olympus, cloaked in Amphitryon's form, probably after practicing his voice and mannerisms for a few hours. You can almost imagine him in front of a celestial mirror, trying to get Amphitryon's slightly weary, post-battle slouch just right. He arrives, tells Alcmen all the details of his recent military victory, details he'd conveniently gathered via divine omniscience, and settles in. It was the ultimate act of cosmic identity theft, performed with the casual confidence of someone who knows there are absolutely no consequences, because he literally makes the rules. He wasn't just impersonating a soldier. He was delivering a full-blown one-man theatrical performance for an audience of one. To ensure this little escapade wasn't rushed, Zeus did something profoundly extra. He ordered Helios, the sun god, to take a couple of days off. Just don't rise. He essentially put the entire world on snooze for 72 hours so he could have an uninterrupted long weekend. Imagine the sheer chaos this caused. Roosters everywhere, their internal clocks completely shattered, standing on fences in utter, confused silence. Farmers stumbling around in the dark, wondering if this was the apocalypse or just a really, really persistent cloudy spell. All of global civilization was put on hold, plunged into a single, unnaturally long night. All because your father was too important to be bothered by the sunrise. It was the most selfish, cosmically disruptive booty call in history. And then, just as the sun was finally getting the divine go-ahead to rise, the real Amphitryon came home. He walks through the city gates, dusty, tired, and expecting a hero's welcome. He arrives at his front door, only to be met with a wife who seems strangely satisfied. "Welcome home, darling," she might have said, a little confused. "Again?" The ensuing conversation must have been a masterclass in awkwardness. He, talking about the battles he just fought. She, talking about the battles he told her he just fought last night. It's the ancient Greek equivalent of discovering your partner has already watched the entire season finale with a perfect deepfake of you, and they thought your acting was a little more dramatic than usual. The confusion was so profound, they had to call in a professional. They consulted the blind prophet Tiresias, the go-to guy for all divine and mystical HR issues. Tiresias calmly explained that Alcmene had been visited by Zeus, and that she would bear 2 sons. You, Hercules, the son of a god, and Iphicles, conceived with the actual Amphitryon upon his return, a son of a mortal. Amphitryon, upon hearing this, had a choice: rage, despair, or quiet, resigned acceptance that his wife had been chosen by the CEO of the cosmos. He wisely chose the latter. And so, your life began, not with a bang, but with a deeply confusing domestic dispute and a family tree that would require a flowchart to properly explain at parties. Your mother's impending childbirth didn't go unnoticed by Hera, Zeus's perpetually irritated wife, who had a penchant for holding grudges longer than a bad Yelp review. Hera, a master of passive-aggressive divine intervention, decided to mess with your birth order. She tricked Zeus into declaring that the next child born in the Perseid line would be king. Then, she magically sped up the birth of your cousin, Eurystheus, and delayed yours. It was less a cosmic intervention and more a bureaucratic nightmare, ensuring you'd always be playing second fiddle to a considerably less impressive ruler. You have to understand, the atmosphere on Mount Olympus wasn't always jovial feasts and ambrosia. More often than not, it resembled a deeply uncomfortable holiday dinner where everyone knows the hosts are fighting. Hera's anger wasn't a loud, theatrical storm. It was a cold, silent pressure that could curdle the nectar in your cup. She saw you, the unborn son of her philandering husband, not as an innocent child, but as the latest, most galling press release in a long series of PR disasters. Her revenge wouldn't be swift and clean. It would be intricate, legalistic, and designed for maximum long-term irony. She was about to weaponize fine print on a cosmic scale. The opportunity arose on a day much like any other. Zeus, in a moment of paternal pride, was boasting to the assembled gods about the magnificent son he was about to bestow upon the world. He was practically handing out divine cigars. Hera saw her opening. She approached him, not with the fury she felt, but with a serene, encouraging smile that should have set off every alarm bell in the pantheon. "My dearest, powerful husband," she cooed, "what a magnificent proclamation. You should make it a binding oath, sworn upon the river Styx, so that all may know your word is law." Zeus, his ego blinding him to the obvious trap, puffed out his chest and did exactly that. He swore an unbreakable oath that the very next male, descendant of Perseus to be born, would become the great king of Mycenae. In that moment, Hera knew she had him. It was the divine equivalent of getting someone to sign a contract without reading the terms and conditions. With the trap set, Hera moved with chilling efficiency. She immediately dispatched her loyal subordinate, Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, on a two-part mission. First, to the palace of King Sthenelus, another descendant of Perseus. His wife was pregnant, but the baby, your cousin Eurystheus, was only at the 7-month mark. No matter. Eileithyia was instructed to induce labor immediately. You can imagine the scene. A rushed, premature birth. A tiny, unimpressive infant being forced into the world to meet a divine deadline. Eurystheus wasn't born. He was launched, like a piece of software pushed out of beta testing far too early, full of bugs and destined to be underwhelming. But he was born first. Checkmate. Next, Eileithyia zipped over to Thebes, where your mother Alcmene was in the throes of labor. Her task here was not to speed things up, but to create a divine roadblock. She didn't storm the room. She simply sat outside the door, crossed her legs, clasped her fingers together, and began to weave a magic spell of delay. It was a supernatural filibuster. Inside, your mother's labor stalled for 7 agonizing days and nights. The air grew thick with sweat and fear as midwives worked fruitlessly. You, a being of immense power, were held in limbo, your grand entrance into the world put on hold by a goddess, engaging in a magical sit-in protest just outside the door. The spell was only broken when one of Alcmene's clever servants, a woman named Galanthis, realized something supernatural was afoot. She ran from the room, shouting with false joy that the baby had been born. Startled, Eileithyia leapt to her feet, uncrossing her legs and breaking the binding spell. In that instant, you were finally born. A strong, healthy baby, second past the finish line. As a petty parting gift, Hera had Galanthis unceremoniously transformed into a weasel. Up on Olympus, Zeus heard the cry of the premature Eurystheus, followed moments later by your own powerful wail, and realized he had been utterly, completely outplayed. He was bound by his own foolish oath, and so your destiny was sealed. You were born to be a hero, but thanks to the cold, bureaucratic fury of your stepmother, you were also born to be a subject. Even as a tiny infant, you were a target. Hera, never one to give up on a vendetta, sent 2 massive serpents into your crib. Your twin brother, Iphicles, did the sensible thing and screamed. You, however, being the future Hercules, apparently thought they were teething toys. You calmly strangled both venomous snakes, one in each hand, before going back to your nap. It was an early sign that your stress management techniques were unconventional, to say the least. Your parents, understandably, were probably less impressed and more traumatized. Picture the nursery, deep in the heart of Amphitryon's home in Thebes. The hour is late, well past midnight. A single oil lamp sputters in the corner, casting a soft golden glow on the walls. The only sounds are the gentle rhythm of two infants breathing and the distant chirp of crickets outside the window. You and your twin, Iphicles, are asleep in a large crib, perhaps fashioned from your father's broad bronze shield, lined with soft wool. For a moment, it is a scene of perfect domestic tranquility. Your parents are finally asleep, believing the worst of the divine drama is over. They are, of course, completely wrong. Hera's grudge wasn't a fleeting storm. It was a low-pressure system settling in for the long haul. Growing up, you were spirited. Let's just say impulsive, and leave it at that. Your musical education, under the tutelage of Linus, Orpheus's brother no less, ended rather abruptly when you, in a fit of pique, bludgeoned him to death with his own lyre. It wasn't exactly a stellar review for his teaching methods, and it certainly put a damper on your chances of getting into the ancient Greek Juilliard. Your parents, instead of grounding you, decided sending you to herd cattle in the countryside was the more appropriate disciplinary action. Your stepfather, Amphitryon, truly did try his best. He arranged for you to have the finest education a young nobleman could receive. You learned wrestling from the master thief Autolycus, archery from the kingly Eurytus, and even how to drive a war chariot from Amphitryon himself. The problem was that your inherent skill set was less suited to learning and more suited to accidental demolition. A friendly wrestling match could easily end with your instructor being thrown through a wall. A lesson in charioteering involved you gripping the reins with such force that they'd snap like old twine. Your teachers weren't so much educators as they were professional risk managers, spending most of their time calculating how far they needed to stand from you to avoid being accidentally launched into orbit. The music lesson was, in hindsight, a particularly terrible idea. Picture a sun-drenched courtyard in Thebes. The air is warm and smells of baking bread and jasmine. Your teacher is Linus, a man from a family of artistic legends who likely believed that music could soothe any soul. He was about to find the exception. He places the lyre in your hands, a beautiful instrument of polished tortoise shell and supple antelope horn. Your hands, already as large and calloused as a stonemason's, dwarf the delicate thing. As he instructs you on fingering and melody, the sounds you produce are less like music and more like the frantic, discordant twanging of a snapped suspension bridge cable. Linus, a man accustomed to prodigies, grew frustrated. He corrected your clumsy finger placement. He sighed dramatically at your lack of rhythm. Perhaps he tapped your knuckles with the plectrum, or worse, called you a brainless lout. For him, it was a moment of pedagogical exasperation. For you, it was the final straw. All the day's frustrations, the feeling of being too big, too strong, too clumsy for this delicate world, coalesced into a single, blinding flash of rage. You weren't thinking of murder. You likely weren't thinking at all. You simply grabbed the most immediate object, the source of your torment, the beautiful, frustrating lyre, and swung. The sharp, sickening crack of wood and bone echoed in the sudden, terrible silence of the courtyard. Linus, brother of Orpheus, lay dead on the flagstones. You were, of course, put on trial. This was still a civilized society, after all. but your legal defense was a masterpiece of creative justification. You argued that a law passed by the wise Rhadamanthus allowed for lethal self-defense if an instructor used undue force. You claimed Linus had struck you first, and you had simply defended yourself. It was the ancient equivalent of pleading temporary insanity after a bad performance review. Astonishingly, you were acquitted. But Amphitryon, looking at his demigod son who had just been cleared of murder on a technicality, made a pragmatic executive decision. You were a liability in polite society. You were too strong, your temper too short. So, he sent you away to the rugged slopes of Mount Cithaeron to live as a herdsman. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a containment strategy. Let you live in the wild, where your strength was an asset, not a catastrophic flaw. You spent your days in the quiet company of cattle, breathing the clean mountain air. Here, when you fought, it was against wolves and lions that threatened your flock. Here, your immense strength was useful for uprooting trees for firewood, not for ending the careers of promising musicians. It was in this solitude, far from the fragile complexities of civilization, that your true education finally began. You weren't destined to play the lyre. You were destined to break the things that needed breaking. Your first major heroics involved a pesky lion that was terrorizing the flocks of King Thespius. This wasn't just any lion. This was a particularly aggressive, livestock-munching menace. You, still a teenager, hunted it down and killed it single-handedly, using only your wits and, presumably, a whole lot of adolescent fury. It was the ancient Greek equivalent of taking out a particularly stubborn weed in the garden, except the weed roared and had very sharp teeth. By now, you were 18 years old, and the solitude of the mountains had shaped you. The awkward, impulsive boy who couldn't handle a music lesson had grown into a young man of terrifying physical prowess. You were taller, broader, and stronger than anyone in the region, living a quiet life, tending your stepfather's cattle on the rugged slopes of Mount Cithaeron. The air was thin and clean, scented with wild thyme and pine. It was a peaceful existence, punctuated by the occasional need to fight off a wolf. But this lion was different. It wasn't just hunting for sustenance. It was a destructive force, slaughtering entire flocks belonging to King Thespius, and even your own family. It was less a predator and more a walking, roaring natural disaster that was seriously disrupting the local agricultural economy. So, one morning, you decided you'd had enough. This wasn't a quest bestowed by a king. It was a personal pest control mission. You grabbed your sturdy club, carved from the wood of an olive tree you'd uprooted yourself, and set off. You didn't need supplies or a support team. You were a walking, talking support team. The hunt was a quiet, patient affair. For days, you tracked the beast through the rocky defiles and shadowed valleys of the mountain. You moved with a silence that belied your size, learning its patterns, its territory. This wasn't about rage, it was about focus. You finally cornered it in its lair, a dark cave that smelled of old bones and damp earth. The fight, when it came, was not long, but it was ferocious. A whirlwind of claws and muscle against your own divinely forged strength. In the end, your club and your bare hands were more than enough. You returned to the city of Thespiae, not with a triumphant shout, but by simply dragging the enormous carcass behind you. As a practical measure, you skinned the beast and fashioned its hide into a rough cloak, pulling its head over your own like a grim, intimidating hood. It was your first iconic look. King Thespius was, of course, overjoyed. His lion problem was solved. To express his gratitude, he insisted you stay at his palace for a celebratory feast that was to last for 50 days. You, a young man used to the solitary life of a shepherd, accepted the hospitality. You probably should have read the fine print. King Thespius had a very specific, very ambitious agenda. He had 50 daughters, and upon seeing you, this magnificent specimen of demigod genetics, he decided he wanted his entire family line to benefit. He devised a plan that was part matchmaking, part eugenics program, and entirely bizarre. Each night, for the 50 nights you stayed at his palace, he sent one of his daughters to your chambers. The myths are a bit hazy on your level of awareness. Either you were so deep in your celebratory wine that you didn't notice it was a different woman every night, or you simply thought one of his daughters was being particularly dedicated in her hospitality. Whatever the case, you diligently obliged. It was less a reward for your heroism, and more of a very strange, long-term administrative task you were assigned to complete. When the 50 days were done, you left Thespiae, your first heroic deed complete. You had rid the land of a monster and, in the process, had unknowingly sired an entire generation. You walked away from the city as a proven hero, a man who could solve epic problems. You left behind a dead lion, a very grateful king, and a genealogical situation so complex it would confound scholars for centuries. Your teenage years were officially over. Your chaotic, monster-filled career had just begun. After some more adventures, you married Princess Megara and had a few children. Life was looking up, relatively normal for a demigod. But Hera wasn't done with you. She struck you with a fit of divine madness, a temporary insanity that made you believe your wife and children were enemies. You tragically killed them all. When you awoke from the fog, the horror of what you had done was overwhelming. It was the ultimate, "What did I do last night?" moment, except with considerably more devastating consequences than a bad hangover. Before the darkness fell, there was a period of genuine peace. After single-handedly defending Thebes from the invading minions, the grateful king, Creon, gave you his daughter Megara's hand in marriage. For a time, you settled into a life of surprising domesticity. Your home was not a grand palace, but a comfortable stone house filled with the sounds of a young family. The air smelled of roasting meats and freshly baked bread. You, the man who wrestled lions, would sit by the hearth, carefully carving a small wooden horse for your son, your immense strength for once focused on a delicate, gentle task. You had a wife who loved you, and several children who saw you not as a demigod, but simply as their father. It was a fragile, beautiful normality, and it was precisely this happiness that made you such an irresistible target for Hera's cruelty. Hera's intervention was not a thunderous declaration of war. It was a silent, insidious poison slipped into the wine of your mind. One evening, as you sat with your family, the warm glow of the oil lamps began to flicker strangely. The familiar, loving face of your wife seemed to distort at the edges, the cheerful chatter of your children twisting into something guttural and menacing. It was not a feeling of anger that overcame you, but a complete and total system failure of your perception. Hera reached down from Olympus and uploaded a virus directly into your consciousness, one that overwrote reality with a terrifying hallucination. In your mind, your home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a fortress under siege by monstrous enemies. Your wife, Megara, transformed into a snarling beast, a creature of nightmare lunging at you with claws extended. Your children were no longer your own, but grotesque, demonic imps, their innocent laughter warped into hostile shrieks. Every instinct, honed by years of fighting real monsters, screamed at you to defend yourself, to protect your home. You grabbed your familiar weapons, your bow, your heavy club, and you did what you had been born to do. You fought. In your madness, you were a hero, courageously dispatching the terrifying invaders who had defiled your hearth. You were efficient, powerful, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of your actions. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the madness receded. Hera withdrew her influence, and the fog in your mind evaporated. The hellish landscape of your hallucination dissolved, and the world snapped back into focus. You stood, breathing heavily, in the center of your quiet, familiar home. The monstrous growls were gone, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. And then you saw them. Not the bodies of demons or giants, but your own wife and your own children, lying still amidst the overturned furniture and scattered toys. The wooden horse you had been carving lay unbroken on the floor. The strength drained from your limbs, not from exhaustion, but from the crushing, impossible weight of understanding. There was no enemy here. There had only ever been you. You fell to your knees in the wreckage of the life you had built, the hero's weapons slipping from your grasp. This was a wound no monster could inflict, a guilt so profound it felt like a physical poison. This singular, horrific act, born not of your will, but of a goddess's vicious prank, would become the dark star around which the rest of your mortal life would orbit. It was the tragedy that would send you stumbling towards the oracle at Delphi, desperate for any path, any labor, that could possibly lead to atonement. Overwhelmed by guilt, you consulted the oracle of Delphi to seek purification and a path to atonement. The oracle, a cryptic spiritual advisor, informed you that you must serve your cousin, King Eurystheus of Mycenae, for 12 years and complete a series of tasks he would assign. It was the ancient world's most extreme form of community service, handed down by a disembodied voice in a cave. Following the massacre of your family, you became a ghost in your own country. You were tainted by miasma, a kind of spiritual stain that made you a pariah. Friends would not share a meal with you. Townsfolk would cross the street to avoid you. So you wandered, a man of immense power, rendered impotent by his own grief, sleeping in forests and drinking from streams. The journey to Delphi wasn't a heroic quest. It was the slow, shuffling walk of a broken man toward the world's most famous spiritual emergency room. The road was long and dusty, winding through the sun-scorched hills of Greece, each step a quiet penance in itself. You were heading to the one place that might have an answer, the sacred center of the world, to ask a god how to fix a life you had so completely shattered. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi was nestled dramatically on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. The air here felt cleaner, thinner, charged with a quiet energy. You, a hulking figure cloaked in grief, moved like a shadow up the sacred way, passing the gleaming treasuries built by city-states to honor the god. You were an outcast here as anywhere else, a stark contrast to the hopeful pilgrims and proud priests. Inside the great temple, the air was cool and dark, smelling of burnt offerings and ancient stone. Carved into the entrance were the famous maxims, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess." Both felt like a personal, cosmic insult, aimed directly at you, a demigod who knew nothing of his own nature and for whom excess was a birthright. After the necessary rituals and costly offerings, divine consultation was never free. You were led to the temple's inner sanctum. This was the Aditon, a sunken chamber where the god was said to speak. A strange, sweet-smelling vapor rose from a fissure in the earth, coiling in the enclosed space. It was here that the Pythia, the high priestess, sat upon a great bronze tripod, her eyes unfocused, her body swaying gently. She was not a queen or a sage, but an ordinary woman who, in this sacred place, became a conduit, a living vessel for the voice of Apollo. She was the divine equivalent of a satellite dish, pointed directly at the heavens, ready to channel a message you were desperate to hear. You asked your question, your voice probably raw with desperation. How could you be clean again? What could you possibly do to atone for such a crime? The Pythia began to speak, her voice distant and strange, as if coming from across the world. First, she gave you a new identity. You had been born Alcides. She was the first to call you Hercules, the glory of Hera. It was a name of staggering, brutal irony, a cosmic joke rebranding you in the name of your greatest tormentor. Then came the sentence. Apollo's decree was not one of comfort or mercy. You were to travel to the city of Mycenae, to the court of your cousin Eurystheus, the weak, conniving man who had stolen your birthright as king. You were to submit to him completely and perform 10 labors of his choosing. You left the cool darkness of the temple and stepped back into the blinding sunlight, the oracle's words echoing in your mind. There was no comfort in the prophecy, only a clear and deeply humiliating path forward. You, the mighty son of Zeus, were now an indentured servant. The price for your absolution was to place your life and destiny into the hands of a lesser man, your jealous cousin, who was now effectively your new, divinely appointed parole officer. Your aimless wandering was over. You now had a destination, Mycenae, and a purpose, to begin the longest, most difficult, and most demeaning job application in history. Your first labor was to kill the Nemean lion, a beast with impenetrable hide that terrorized the region. Arrows bounced off it, spears merely scratched its tough skin. You tracked it to its cave, realized conventional weapons were useless, and then proceeded to wrestle it to death with your bare hands. Imagine trying to open a particularly stubborn jar of pickles, except the pickle jar is a snarling 500-pound lion that wants to eat your face. You arrived at the gates of Mycenae, a city famous for its massive, imposing walls. In the throne room, you came face to face with your cousin and newly appointed boss, King Eurystheus. He sat upon his throne, a small man dwarfed by the grand hall, trying to project an aura of authority that his trembling hands completely betrayed. He was, to put it mildly, terrified of you. He saw not a cousin seeking atonement, but a divine wrecking ball who had a legitimate claim to his throne. So, for your first task, he chose something he was certain would be a permanent, fatal solution to his Hercules problem. He ordered you to go to the valley of Nemean and bring back the hide of a monstrous lion, a beast rumored to be the offspring of monsters, whose golden fur was completely impervious to any weapon. As you journeyed into the sun-scorched hills of Nemean, you found the local populace living in a state of constant fear. Shepherds kept their flocks locked away, and the roads were eerily empty. You tracked the beast for days, finding its massive paw prints and the grisly remains of its victims. Finally, you saw it, its golden coat shimmering in the heat haze. It was larger and more formidable than any lion you had ever encountered. You drew your bow, a weapon that had never failed you, and let an arrow fly. It struck the lion square in the flank with a dull thwack and simply fell off, the arrowhead completely blunted. The lion flicked its ear as if shooing a fly. You then tried your bronze sword, which bent on impact, and finally your massive olive wood club, which shattered against the lion's skull with a loud crack, succeeding only in annoying it. Realizing that conventional methods were about as effective as throwing pillows at a fortress, you changed your strategy. You tracked the lion back to its lair, a dark cave that ran straight through a rocky hill with an entrance on each side. Seeing your opportunity, you dragged a collection of massive boulders and sealed one of the entrances, turning the tunnel into a dead-end trap. With its escape route cut off, you entered the cave through the remaining opening. The air inside was cool and thick with the overpowering stench of death. As your eyes adjusted to the gloom, you saw two golden orbs ignite in the darkness. The hunt was over. The real work was about to begin. The lion lunged, a blur of muscle and fury, but you met its charge head-on. This was not a battle of skill or tactics. It was a primal contest of pure brute force. You grabbed hold of the beast, your arms wrapping around its massive neck. Its claws, which could tear a bull in half, slid harmlessly off your own divinely tough skin. It was a slow, grueling stalemate in the dark. A silent, suffocating wrestling match. The cave was filled only with the sound of straining muscles and the beast's choked snarls. You squeezed, channeling all of your divine strength into your grip, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, the great beast's struggles ceased, and it fell limp in your arms. You had succeeded, but a new problem arose: how to acquire the hide Eurystheus demanded. Your knife couldn't cut it. Nothing could. As you sat there, contemplating the logistical nightmare, you had a moment of grim inspiration. The only thing sharp enough to pierce the lion's invulnerable hide must be the lion's own claws. You carefully took one of its razor-sharp talons and used it to painstakingly skin the beast. You then returned to Mycenae, not just with the hide, but wearing it as a cloak. At the sight of you, alive, triumphant, and dressed in the skin of the unkillable monster, Eurystheus shrieked in terror and hid himself in a large bronze storage jar. From that day forward, he refused to let you inside the city gates, decreeing that all future labor assignments would be delivered by a herald. Your career had begun, and you had already terrified your boss into working from home. Next up was the Lernaean Hydra, a multi-headed serpent whose heads regrew two for everyone you chopped off. This was less a monster and more a living, breathing exercise in futility. Luckily, your nephew Iolaus had the brilliant idea of cauterizing the stumps with a torch after you lopped them off. It was a classic teamwork moment, proving that sometimes you need a smart intern to help you conquer your seemingly insurmountable problems. Eurystheus, thoroughly displeased that you had survived your encounter with his indestructible lion, decided to escalate the difficulty. If a monster that couldn't be damaged wouldn't work, perhaps one that actively multiplied when damaged would do the trick. A herald was dispatched, from a safe distance, of course, to inform you of your next assignment. Travel to the swamps of Lerna and eliminate the Hydra, a venomous multi-headed water serpent raised by Hera herself specifically to be your problem. For this trip, you wisely brought along some backup. Your nephew Iolaus, a capable young man who seemed unfazed by his uncle's bizarre career path, joined you as your charioteer and general assistant. The swamps of Lerna were not a scenic tourist destination. It was a gloomy, sprawling marshland where the air was thick with humidity and the heavy, sweet scent of decay. The ground sucked at your sandals with every step, and the only sounds were the incessant buzzing of insects and the soft, sinister bubbling of stagnant water. You located the creature's lair, a spring near a plane tree, and began the process of flushing it out, firing flaming arrows into the darkness until the monster emerged. It was a grotesque sight, a colossal serpentine body supporting 9 heads, each one swaying on a long neck, hissing a breath so poisonous it could kill a man with a single whiff. With the confidence of a man who had recently strangled a lion, you waded into battle. You swung your sword, and with a clean, powerful stroke, lopped one of the hissing heads from its body. For a brief, satisfying moment, you had the upper hand. Then, to your profound dismay, the neck writhed and sprouted two new, fully formed heads where the one had been. You had not wounded the beast, you had improved it. You tried again, severing another head, only to see two more spring forth in a gruesome display of regenerative biology. You were trapped in a horrifying loop of mythological math, where every subtraction resulted in addition. To make matters worse, Hera, who was apparently monitoring the situation like a vindictive reality show producer, decided the fight wasn't challenging enough. She sent a giant crab scuttling out of the mire to assist the Hydra. This creature, Karkinos by name, latched onto your foot with its pincers. It was less a mortal threat and more a deeply irritating distraction, like a pop-up ad in the middle of a critical boss fight. Annoyed, you crushed the crab under your heel with a decisive stomp and returned your focus to the ever-expanding snake problem. It was then that you called out to your nephew. Iolaus, having watched your futile efforts from the safety of the chariot, had a moment of inspiration. "Uncle," he shouted, "we can't let them grow back." He quickly set a nearby patch of forest alight and brought you a series of burning torches. A new, efficient system was born. You would swing your sword, severing a head, and Iolaus would immediately rush in and press the flaming brand against the bleeding stump. The fire and smoke seared the wound, cauterizing the flesh and preventing any new heads from growing. One by one, you systematically worked your way through the monster's mortal heads. The central head, however, was immortal. Realizing it couldn't be killed, you simply chopped it off, dug a hole, and buried it under a massive boulder. Problem solved, or at least problem indefinitely contained. Before leaving, you dipped your arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, creating a deadly new addition to your arsenal. You returned to Mycenae, only for Eurystheus to disqualify the labor on the grounds that you'd had help. It was a harsh lesson in corporate policy. Teamwork, apparently, was not a billable hour. Your third task was to capture the Ceryneian Hind, a magnificent golden-antlered deer sacred to Artemis. This wasn't a kill mission. It was a capture mission, requiring patience and subtlety. Two things you weren't exactly known for. You chased it for a full year, across mountains and rivers, before finally trapping it. It was the ancient equivalent of trying to catch a particularly elusive, very well camouflaged Pokémon, but with considerably higher stakes and no Pokeballs. After your successes with the lion and the Hydra, Eurystheus realized that challenging your strength was a losing strategy. So, for your third labor, he devised a task that was less about power and more about creating a bureaucratic and diplomatic nightmare. His command was simple: bring him the Ceryneian Hind, alive and unharmed. This creature was no ordinary deer. It had antlers of pure gold, hooves of bronze, and was so fleet of foot it was said to outrun an arrow. More importantly, it was the personal sacred property of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, a deity known for her formidable temper. Eurystheus's plan was brilliant in its malice. Either you would fail the impossible chase, or you would succeed, harm the deer, and have to deal with the wrath of an angry Olympian. It was a classic corporate no-win scenario, and so began the longest, most monotonous chase in mythological history. You first sighted the hind in the fields of Wunoi, its golden antlers catching the sun like a beacon. It saw you, and the pursuit began. Through the heat of the Greek summer, you followed it, a constant, tireless shadow. Across dusty plains and through dense forests it led you, its bronze hooves barely seeming to touch the ground. As summer bled into autumn, the chase continued, You learned the rhythm of its flight, the pattern of its impossibly swift gait. The world turned from green to gold, and still you ran, the distant glint of its antlers your only guide. The pursuit led you ever northward. Winter found you in the mythical land of the Hyperboreans, a place of deep snow and perpetual twilight beyond the north wind. The air was thin and bitingly cold. The world was a vast expanse of white, broken only by the dark shapes of trees. Still the Hind ran on, its bronze hooves kicking up plumes of snow, its golden antlers a stark contrast to the frozen landscape. Your divine stamina kept you from freezing. Your demigod determination kept you from giving up. This was no longer a fight. It was a test of endurance, a year-long, continent-spanning marathon. As the world thawed into spring, you followed it south again, back into the familiar lands of Arcadia. After a full year of constant pursuit, you finally saw your chance. Near the banks of the river Ladon, the Hind, at last showing a hint of exhaustion, paused to drink. You knew your club or your hands would be too crude and would surely harm it, invoking Artemis's fury. Instead, you drew your bow. This was not a shot of power, but of surgical precision. You waited for the perfect moment, your breath held steady, and released the arrow. It flew true, passing harmlessly through the flesh and sinew of both of the hind's forelegs, pinning them together without shattering a single bone. The creature stumbled, immobilized and captured, but essentially unharmed. You lifted the sacred animal onto your broad shoulders and began the long walk back to Mycenae. You were almost home when two figures blocked your path, radiating an aura of pure, divine fury. It was Apollo and, more terrifyingly, Artemis herself. She was livid. You had laid hands on her sacred creature. Instead of preparing for a fight you couldn't win, you simply and calmly explained the situation. You laid out the terms of your penance, the decree from the oracle, and the petty demands of your boss, Eurystheus. You were not a poacher, you explained, but merely a very put-upon employee. Seeing the truth in your words, and perhaps respecting the sheer effort of your year-long chase, Artemis relented, allowing you to complete your labor on the condition that the Hind was released once Eurystheus had seen it. You delivered the creature, alive and well, to your cousin's court, completed the task, and then set it free, watching it bound away back to its divine mistress. You had succeeded not through strength, but through patience and, for once, some remarkably effective diplomacy. Eurystheus sent you to capture the Erymanthian boar, a gigantic, tusky pig that was wreaking havoc on the local populace. This wasn't a cute farm hog. This was a destructive force of nature. You chased it through deep snow until it was exhausted, then trapped it in a net and dragged it back to Mycenae. Eurystheus, upon seeing the live, snorting beast, apparently hid in a pythos, a large storage jar. It was probably the least dignified reaction to a perfectly executed task you could imagine. Having failed to defeat you with invulnerability, regeneration, or diplomatic incidents, Eurystheus reverted to a simpler strategy: find another enormous, angry animal and hope for the best. The target was the Erymanthian boar, a beast of legendary size and ferocity that was rampaging across the countryside of Arcadia, goring livestock and uprooting entire olive groves with its tusks. Your task, once again, was to bring it back alive, a logistical and humiliating nightmare designed to have you wrestle a furious, several hundred-pound slab of muscle and tusks across half of Greece. It was less a heroic quest and more an extreme, hazardous livestock transportation job. On your way to the mountain, you took a brief detour to visit an old friend, a wise and gentle centaur named Pholus. He offered you hospitality in his cave, roasting meat for your meal. When you asked for wine, however, he grew hesitant. The only wine he had was a special cask, a gift from Dionysus to all the centaurs of the region, and he feared opening it would attract unwanted attention. You, being persuasive and perhaps a bit thirsty, convinced him it would be fine. It was not fine. The moment the cask was opened, the rich, fragrant aroma of the divine wine drifted through the mountains, acting as a dinner bell for every other centaur in the vicinity. They descended on the cave in a drunken, aggressive rage, and a full-scale brawl erupted. In the chaos, you were forced to use your Hydra poisoned arrows, tragically killing your host Pholus by accident and inflicting an eternal, agonizing wound on the great centaur Chiron. It was a disastrous and somber start to your mission. With a heavy heart, you left the tragic scene and continued up the slopes of Mount Erymanthos. It was deep winter, and the higher you climbed, the thicker the snow became. The world grew quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of your footsteps and the sharp whistle of the wind through the barren trees. This time, your plan was not to match the beast's strength, but to use the environment against it. You found the boar's tracks and began to make a tremendous racket, shouting and clashing, your sword against your shield, driving the terrified and enraged animal out of the thickets and up the mountain, higher and higher into the deep, powdery snowdrifts. The chase was a matter of strategy, not stamina. The boar, an angry, tusked bulldozer on open ground, was hopelessly clumsy in the deep snow. Its short, powerful legs and heavy body caused it to sink and flounder, while you, with your longer stride, could navigate the drifts more easily. Soon, the great beast was exhausted, trapped, and panting in a massive snowbank. The fight was already over. You approached the tired animal, threw a heavy woven net over its back, and securely bound its legs. The capture was complete. Now came the truly undignified part, the delivery. You heaved the live, struggling and furiously squealing boar onto your shoulders and began the long trek back to Mycenae. It was an arduous and profoundly ridiculous journey, carrying a beast that weighed as much as a small boulder and that complained loudly the entire way. When you finally arrived at the court and the herald announced your presence, you strode into the throne room and unceremoniously dumped the thrashing, snorting boar at Eurystheus's feet. The king took one wide-eyed look at the very real, very angry monster you'd brought into his home, let out a pathetic shriek, and promptly leapt into a large bronze storage jar, refusing to come out. You stood there, mission accomplished, while the ruler of the Argolid cowered in a pot. It was a scene that perfectly encapsulated your entire working relationship. For your fifth labor, you were tasked with cleaning the Augean stables, which hadn't been cleaned in 30 years and housed 1,000 cattle. It was the ultimate disgusting chore, a task designed to humiliate you. You, however, ingeniously rerouted 2 rivers, the Alpheus and Peneus, to flush out the muck in a single day. It was less about brute strength and more about ancient hydraulic engineering, making you the unexpected hero of waste management. Eurystheus, having exhausted his supply of overtly lethal monsters, decided to pivot to a strategy of pure, soul-crushing humiliation. He wanted to see you, the celebrated son of Zeus, brought low by the most demeaning task imaginable. He ordered you to travel to Elis and clean the stables of King Augeas. These weren't just any stables. They housed thousands of divine cattle. And for 3 decades, the waste had simply been allowed to accumulate. The task wasn't merely disgusting. It was of geological proportions. The filth was piled so high that it was more a feature of the landscape than a mess, creating a divine public health hazard that radiated a stench for miles around. Eurystheus pictured you spending months up to your neck in filth, your heroic reputation dissolving in a sea of muck. Upon arriving in the otherwise pleasant pastoral kingdom of Elise, you approached King Augean, not as a servant fulfilling a penance, but as a contractor looking for work. Without mentioning Eurystheus, you surveyed the monumental task and made the king a wager. You boldly claimed you could clean the entire complex in a single day. Augean, who likely hadn't seen the floor of his own stables since he was a boy, laughed at the sheer audacity of your proposal. He smugly agreed to your terms. If you succeeded, you would receive 1/10 of his magnificent herd. If you failed, you would receive nothing but ridicule. The king's own son, Phileus, stood by and witnessed the oath, a fact that would become important later. The next morning, Augean and his court gathered to watch the spectacle, expecting to see you grab the world's largest shovel. Instead, you ignored the stables entirely and went for a walk, calmly surveying the surrounding topography. You weren't planning your attack. You were performing a geotechnical survey. You noted the gentle slope of the land and the proximity of two powerful rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. In that moment, you saw the solution. This wasn't a problem of manual labor. It was a problem of plumbing, and you were about to invent the industrial power washer. Your work began not with a shovel, but with your bare hands. First, you went to the two opposite ends of the massive stable yard, and, with your incredible strength, tore massive breaches in the stone walls, creating a large entrance and an equally large exit. Then, you walked to the banks of the two rivers. You began heaving boulders and digging new channels in the earth, diverting the powerful currents from their natural courses. You carved new paths for the water, aiming them directly at the opening you had just created in the stable wall. What happened next was a masterclass in ancient engineering. The combined force of the two rivers poured through the breach, transforming into a single, churning torrent that surged through the vast stables. The sound was a deafening, cleansing roar. The floodwaters lifted 3 decades of accumulated filth, a tidal wave of muck that was washed effortlessly through the enclosure and out the exit on the other side, harmlessly dispersing down the valley. By late afternoon, the job was done. The stables were immaculately clean, the stone floors visible for the first time in a generation. You calmly redirected the rivers back to their original paths and went to collect your payment. This, however, is where the trouble started. King Augean, upon learning that this task was part of your labors for Eurystheus, refused to honor the deal. When his own son Phileus testified against him, the enraged king banished both of you from his kingdom. You returned to Mycenae, only for Eurystheus to disqualify the labor on the petty grounds that you had attempted to do it for profit. You had successfully completed a supernatural sanitation project of epic proportions, only to be denied both payment and credit. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes the most unpleasant part of any job is dealing with management. Your next challenge was to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating birds with bronze beaks and metallic feathers that shot like arrows. These weren't your average pigeons. These were airborne avian assassins. Athena, recognizing the absurdity of fighting a flock of murderous birds, gave you a pair of bronze castanets. You clanged them together, startling the birds into flight, and then shot them down with arrows. It was a surprisingly elegant solution to a very messy problem, proving that sometimes a good distraction is all you need. Having failed to best you with tasks of strength, endurance, or humiliation, Eurystheus settled on a tactical puzzle. He ordered you to Arcadia to deal with the Stymphalian birds. These creatures, sacred to Ares, the god of war, had migrated to the dense, swampy forests surrounding Lake Stymphalia to escape a plague of wolves. The problem wasn't just the birds themselves, with their man-eating habits and deadly metallic plumage. It was their environment. The swampland was a treacherous, murky bog, too soft to bear your weight and too thick with gnarled trees to navigate. You couldn't get to them, but their projectile feathers could certainly get to you. It was the ancient world's equivalent of being tasked to clear out a sniper's nest in an impassable jungle. You arrived at the edge of the lake and were met with a scene of deep gloom. A thick, damp fog hung low over the stagnant black water, and the twisted branches of the trees overhead blocked out most of the sun. The air was unnaturally still and silent, punctuated only by the unsettling metallic shink of the birds moving through the dense canopy. You stood at the edge of the marsh, completely stumped. Your club was useless against an enemy you couldn't reach, and your arrows were useless against an enemy you couldn't see. For the first time in your labors, brute force had no obvious application. As you stood there contemplating this strategic dead end, the air beside you seemed to shimmer, and the goddess Athena appeared. As the patron of wisdom and strategic warfare, this kind of tactical problem was her specialty. She assessed the situation with a cool, divine gaze, and without much ceremony, presented you with her solution: a pair of bronze crotala, or castanets, forged in the workshop of Hephaestus himself. They were heavy and ornate, and they felt strangely powerful in your hands. This was not a weapon to kill, but a tool to create an opportunity. Her instructions were simple: find a high place and make a noise they can't ignore. Following her advice, you climbed a nearby mountain that overlooked the swamp, giving you a clear vantage point. You took the heavy bronze instruments, one in each hand, and clashed them together. The sound that erupted was not a simple rattle. It was a deafening, unearthly clang, a divine cacophony that echoed through the valley like a series of thunderclaps. The noise, forged by a god, was unbearable to the birds. From the depths of the forest came an explosion of panicked, piercing shrieks. The entire flock burst from the treetops at once, a terrifying, shimmering cloud of bronze and fury, blotting out what little light penetrated the fog as they wheeled in the sky in a chaotic mass. They were finally out in the open, exposed and vulnerable. Now, the second phase of your plan began. With a calm, methodical rhythm, you drew your bow. As the great cloud of deadly birds swirled above the lake, you began to pick them off, one by one. The sharp twang of your bowstring was followed by the whistle of an arrow, and then the distant sound of a metallic body tumbling from the sky into the dark water below. You didn't need to kill all of them. After you had shot down a significant number, the rest of the flock, terrified by the horrifying noise and their mounting losses, broke formation and fled. They flew far across the sea, never to trouble the people of Greece again. The silence that returned to the swamp was no longer menacing, but peaceful. You had completed your labor not through a battle, but through a masterful combination of acoustic warfare and expert marksmanship. Next, you had to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent white bull that Minos, king of Crete, had failed to sacrifice to Poseidon, leading to its rampage. You wrestled it into submission, much like trying to get a particularly stubborn dog into a bath, and then rode it across the Aegean Sea back to Mycenae. It was less a heroic journey, and more a very uncomfortable, potentially salty, bullback ferry ride. For this labor, Eurystheus decided to send you on your first official overseas work trip. Your destination was the island of Crete, a kingdom ruled by the powerful King Minos. The backstory of this particular bull was a masterclass in how not to deal with the gods. Minos had wanted to prove his divine right to rule, so he prayed to Poseidon to send him a sign. The sea god obliged, causing a breathtakingly beautiful, pure white bull to emerge from the waves, with the explicit understanding that Minos would immediately sacrifice it in the god's honor. But Minos, upon seeing the magnificent creature, decided it was far too impressive for a barbecue. He added the divine bull to his personal herd and sacrificed a lesser animal in its place, hoping Poseidon was too busy to notice the swap. Poseidon noticed. In a stunning act of divine passive aggression, he drove the bull into a mad, destructive frenzy, and as a bonus, made Minos' wife Pasiphae fall in love with it, an affair that would eventually lead to the birth of the Minotaur. This bull wasn't just a monster. It was a walking, fire-breathing monument to bad decisions. You arrived on the sunny shores of Crete and presented yourself to King Minos. The king was likely in a state of deep and profound embarrassment. The bull was a constant, rampaging reminder of his impiety, his broken promise to a major god, and his wife's subsequent and very public scandal. When you offered to remove the creature from his island, he was overjoyed. He offered you no assistance, but gave you his enthusiastic permission to deal with his very large, very angry problem. For him, your labor was less a heroic quest and more a free, desperately needed pest control service. Finding the bull was easy. You just had to follow the trail of destruction. You found it in a field, tearing up olive trees, its white hide gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, and its breath steaming with divine rage. There was no need for strategy or clever gadgets for this one. This was a return to your roots. It was a simple, straightforward challenge of strength. You approached the beast, dodged its initial furious charge, and grabbed it by its powerful horns. It was a raw contest of leverage and power, your demigod strength pitted against the bull's divinely induced madness. Digging your heels into the rich Cretan earth, you twisted and pushed, forcing the great beast's head down until its struggles weakened, and it finally submitted to your will. Now came the logistical puzzle, getting it back to the mainland. You couldn't exactly book passage for a live, mythological monster on the next merchant ship. So, you opted for a more direct, if unconventional, method of travel. You mounted the now subdued bull, drove it to the shoreline, and urged it into the sparkling blue waters of the Augean. The great beast, under your command, began to swim, its powerful legs churning through the waves, carrying you on its back. The journey was a long and surreal one. The sun was warm, the sea was calm, and the rhythmic splashing of the bull's hooves was almost hypnotic. You were, for all intents and purposes, riding a very muscular, organically powered jet ski from Crete to the Peloponnese. Upon reaching the mainland, you calmly dismounted your bovine transport and led the bull all the way to Mycenae. You presented the creature to Eurystheus, who was likely just baffled that you had turned an international incident into a successful business trip. He marveled at the magnificent beast, the source of so much chaos, now standing placidly before him. Having no desire to own such a complicated and divinely charged animal, he simply ordered you to set it free. You did so, and the Cretan bull wandered off into the Greek countryside, eventually making its way to Marathon, where it would become a problem for a different hero to solve at a later date. Your labor was complete, and you had successfully relocated a major mythological figure, proving your skills now included inter-island shipping. Your eighth labor involved capturing the mares of Diomedes, 4 flesh-eating horses belonging to King Diomedes of Thrace. These weren't your friendly neighborhood ponies. They were monsters that snacked on human flesh. You fed their owner, Diomedes, to his own horses, which apparently calmed them down enough for you to lead them away. It was an unconventional approach to equine behavioral therapy, but it certainly got results. With the monsters of southern Greece dwindling, Eurystheus expanded his geographic scope of impossible tasks. This time, he sent you north to the wild, rugged kingdom of Thrace, a land considered by many Greeks to be on the edge of the civilized world. Your objective was to steal the prized horses of its king, Diomedes. This was no simple horse theft. Diomedes, a son of the war god Ares, was a particularly cruel tyrant, and his 4 mares, Podargos, Lampon, Xanthos, and Denos, shared his temperament. They were not fed oats or hay, but the flesh of any unsuspecting travelers who made the mistake of accepting the king's hospitality. For this mission, you recruited a band of young volunteers, eager for adventure, and sailed north into the colder, harsher climes of the Augean. You arrived in Thrace and proceeded directly to the king's stables. There, you found the 4 mares, magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. They were tethered with heavy iron chains to mangers of solid bronze, and their eyes glowed with a feral, unnatural hunger. The air was thick with the grim, metallic scent of old blood. Diomedes kept his pets in a constant state of ravenous fury. After easily overpowering the king's stable hands, you and your men broke the chains and managed to herd the 4 snarling, biting beasts down to your ship on the coast. But the alarm had been raised, and Diomedes and his personal army were in hot pursuit. In a fateful decision, you left the horses under the guard of your youngest and most beloved companion, a young man named Abderus, while you turned to face the Thracian threat. The battle was swift and decisive. You were, after all, Hercules. But when you returned to the shore, victorious, it was to a scene of horror. The savage mares had overpowered Abderus and devoured him. The easy adventure had turned into a tragedy, and your mission was now fueled by a cold, vengeful rage. After routing the last of the Thracian soldiers, you captured the fleeing King Diomedes. You dragged him back to the shore, not to his palace for judgment, but to his own blood-stained stables. There, you presented the cruel king to his monstrous creations. The mares, having just tasted blood, turned on their own master. In a moment of grim, poetic justice, the man who had fed so many innocent people to his horses became their final meal. A strange thing happened then. Once they had consumed the source of their corruption, a profound calm settled over the 4 mares. Their madness seemed to vanish, the unnatural fire in their eyes extinguished. The unconventional therapy had worked. The beasts were finally tame. Before leaving the shores of Thrace, you founded a city in honor of your fallen friend, naming it Abdera. It was a somber monument to the cost of your labor. The journey back was quiet and uneventful. The once monstrous horses, now standing placidly on the deck of your ship. You presented them to Eurystheus, who, as was his custom, was both amazed and terrified. Having absolutely no idea what to do with 4 enormous, formerly carnivorous horses, he had them dedicated to Hera, and then simply set them loose. They wandered into the wilds of Mount Olympus, where they were eventually eaten by wolves. A quiet, mundane end for creatures of such legendary terror. Your labor was complete, but it left you with a city of sorrow, and a stark reminder that your quests were never without consequence. Eurystheus's daughter, Admete, wanted the golden girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Hippolyta was actually quite willing to give it to you, but Hera, ever the spoiler, spread rumors among the Amazons that you were kidnapping their queen. A battle ensued. You killed Hippolyta in the confusion, took the girdle, and left. It was a classic communication breakdown, proving that ancient goddess-level gossip could ruin a perfectly civil transaction. By this point, it seems Eurystheus was taking requests. His daughter, Admete, a priestess of Hera, had heard tales of the magnificent golden girdle worn by Hippolyta, the Amazonian queen, and had decided it was the must-have accessory of the season. This was no mere belt. It was a masterwork of gold and leather, gifted to the queen by the war god Ares himself as a symbol of her power and authority. Your 9th labor, therefore, was to travel to the distant land of Themyscira and perform what amounted to a high-stakes, cross-cultural shopping trip for your boss's daughter. You gathered a crew of Greece's finest heroes and set sail for the Black Sea, heading toward a nation of warrior women with a reputation for not taking kindly to uninvited guests. Your fleet arrived at the port of Themyscira, and the famed Amazons lined the shores, tall and armed, watching your approach with disciplined suspicion. Rather than making a show of force, you opted for diplomacy. You announced your peaceful intentions and requested an audience with their queen. To your surprise, you were granted one. You were brought before Queen Hippolyta, a regal and formidable leader. She had heard the stories of your incredible feats, and far from being hostile, she was deeply impressed by your reputation. She greeted you with honor and respect, and you were invited aboard your ship to talk. The negotiation was the smoothest of your career. You explained the strange circumstances of your quest, the divine penance, and the peculiar request for her girdle. Hippolyta listened, fascinated by your story. Charmed by your heroic presence and perhaps a bit starstruck, she readily agreed to simply give you the girdle as a gift, a token of respect from one great warrior to another. The labor was, for all intents and purposes, complete. There would be no battle, no struggle. All that was left was a handshake and a pleasant voyage home. This, of course, was an outcome that Hera could not possibly tolerate. Watching from Olympus, the goddess seethed at the sight of your peaceful success. She descended to Themyscira, cloaking herself in the guise of a common Amazon warrior. She then moved through the crowd of women who were watching the friendly summit from the shore and began her divine misinformation campaign. "Sisters," she whispered with false urgency, "can't you see what's happening? That Greek foreigner is lulling our queen with sweet words. His true plan is to abduct her and carry her off as a slave." The poison of her rumor spread like wildfire. A lie from a goddess carries immense weight, and the fiercely loyal Amazons believed it without question. From your perspective on the deck of your ship, the scene on the shore devolved into chaos in a matter of seconds. The calm, watchful crowd suddenly erupted into furious war cries. The Amazons, now convinced you were a treacherous kidnapper, leapt onto their horses, drew their weapons, and charged toward your ship in a full-scale assault to rescue their queen. You saw the charging army, and your mind made the only logical leap it could. You had been betrayed. Hippolyta's hospitality, her kindness, her promise, it must have all been an elaborate ruse to lure you into an ambush. Trusting your battle-honed instincts over the surprisingly pleasant meeting you'd just had, you acted instantly. As the first warriors began to storm your ship, you drew your sword. Believing she was the architect of this treachery, you struck down Queen Hippolyta where she stood. A brutal, chaotic battle ensued. You and your men fought your way through the enraged Amazons, snatched the golden girdle from the body of the fallen queen, and battled your way back to open water. You sailed away with your prize, the mission technically accomplished, but the victory was hollow. A simple, peaceful transaction had been twisted by divine gossip into a tragic and bloody misunderstanding. Your 10th labor was to fetch the cattle of the three-bodied giant Geryon, who lived on the island of Erytheia, far to the west. This involved a journey to the edge of the world, a confrontation with a giant and his two-headed dog, Orthrus, and a lot of very, very long walks. You sailed across the ocean in a golden cup, borrowed from Helios, battled Geryon, and then drove the cattle all the way back to Greece. It was less a cattle drive and more an epic, intercontinental beef transportation service. By this point, Eurystheus was clearly just looking at a map and picking the most remote location he could find, hoping you'd get lost along the way. Your destination, the island of Erytheia, was said to lie in the great ocean at the western edge of the world. Your journey there was long and arduous, taking you across the blistering heat of the Libyan desert. The relentless sun became so infuriating that in a moment of pure frustration, you famously drew your bow and fired an arrow straight at Helios, the sun god himself. Rather than being offended, Helios was so amused by your sheer, audacious nerve that he decided to lend you his personal transportation, a massive golden cup that he used to sail across the ocean each night. It was the divine equivalent of complaining about the bus service and being given the CEO's private helicopter for the weekend. Before setting sail, you took a moment to commemorate your journey. At the strait between Europe and Africa, you erected two massive pillars, one on each continent, to mark the absolute limit of the known world. They would forever be known as the Pillars of Hercules, a monumental act of divine graffiti. You then boarded your borrowed golden cup and began a calm, surreal voyage across the vast, uncharted ocean. You landed on the shores of Erytheia, the Red Isle, so named because the entire landscape, the rocks, the grass, the cattle, glowed with a deep crimson light in the rays of the setting sun. Geryon's ranch was protected by a multi-tiered security system. The first alarm was Orthrus, a fearsome, two-headed guard dog who happened to be the brother of Cerberus. As soon as you began rounding up the cattle, he charged. A single, efficient blow from your olive wood club silenced him permanently. The commotion brought out the second layer of security, a herdsman named Eurytion, who met an equally swift and unfortunate end. Finally, the owner himself was alerted to the disturbance. Geryon was a truly bizarre sight, a single creature from the waist down, but with 3 separate torsos, 6 arms, and 3 heads, all sprouting from a single set of legs. He was less a giant and more a walking committee, and he was furious about your hostile takeover of his livestock operation. The ensuing battle was brief. Geryon advanced on you, holding 3 shields and brandishing 3 separate weapons, making him a formidable multitasking opponent. You, however, had no time for a prolonged engagement. You simply drew your bow and fired a single arrow, dipped in the Hydra's incurable poison. The arrow pierced one of his bodies, passed through to the second, and lodged itself in the third, delivering its venom to all 3 parts of the giant at once. Geryon collapsed in a heap, your 10th labor now technically complete, though the most tedious part was yet to begin. You herded the magnificent red cattle into the golden cup, sailed back to the mainland, and politely returned the divine vessel to Helios. Then began the real work, a months-long cross-continental cattle drive back to Greece. The journey was an epic in its own right, fraught with challenges. Hera, never one to miss an opportunity for petty harassment, sent a gadfly to sting the cattle, causing the entire herd to scatter in a panic. You spent weeks painstakingly rounding them all up again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking, you arrived in Mycenae, with the full herd intact. Eurystheus, dumbfounded by your success, accepted the cattle, and then, in a final galling act of spite, sacrificed the entire lot to none other than your sworn enemy, Hera. All that effort just to provide a barbecue for the goddess who hated you most. For your penultimate labor, you had to retrieve the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, guarded by the dragon Ladon. This was a tricky one because no one knew exactly where the garden was. You encountered Prometheus, held up the heavens for Atlas, while he retrieved the apples for you, and then cleverly tricked Atlas into taking the sky back. It was a magnificent display of both brawn and brain, proving that sometimes delegation and a little bit of cosmic deception are key. After sending you to every corner of the known world, Eurystheus finally gave you a task with no known address. Your mission was to steal the golden apples, a wedding gift from Gaia, the earth, to Hera. These were not ordinary fruits. They granted immortality and were kept in Hera's private garden at the world's western edge, tended by the nymph daughters of the evening, the Hesperides, and guarded by Ladon, a never-sleeping, 100-headed dragon. This wasn't just a difficult labor. It was a heist targeting the personal property of the Queen of the Gods. The first problem was that the garden's location was a closely guarded divine secret, the ancient world's equivalent of an unlisted number. Your journey became a long, frustrating search for reliable directions. After several dead ends, you were advised to find Nereus, the prophetic old man of the sea. You found him sleeping on the shore and seized him, demanding information. Nereus, a powerful shapeshifter, was not a willing informant. You held on with all your might as he transformed into a roaring lion, a hissing snake, a torrent of water, and a blazing fire. After running through his entire repertoire of transformations, he finally gave in and told you where to find the garden's keeper. Your journey then led you to the Caucasus Mountains, where you found the Titan Prometheus chained to a rock. Taking pity on him, you shot the eagle that had tormented him for centuries and broke his chains. In gratitude for his freedom, Prometheus gave you a crucial piece of strategic advice. He warned you not to enter the garden or attempt to take the apples yourself. The garden was protected by ancient magic, and its caretakers were the daughters of the Titan Atlas. The key, Prometheus explained, was to delegate. You must persuade Atlas to fetch the apples for you. This vital tip transformed your mission from a potential dragon fight into a delicate and high-stakes negotiation. You traveled to the furthest western edge of the world, where you found the colossal figure of Atlas, his muscles straining as he bore the entire weight of the celestial sphere on his shoulders. You approached the groaning Titan and made your proposition. You, a mere demigod, would take the weight of the heavens off his shoulders if he would briefly pop over to his daughter's garden and retrieve 3 golden apples for you. Atlas, who hadn't had a break in eons, could scarcely believe his luck. The exchange was made. With a great heave, he shifted the cosmos onto your shoulders. The pressure was unimaginable, a crushing weight that threatened to grind you into dust, but your divine strength held firm. For a short while, you were the pillar that held up the world. Atlas soon returned, a triumphant smile on his face, holding 3 gleaming golden apples. "Excellent news," he said casually. "I think I'll deliver these to Eurystheus myself. You just keep holding that for me. Indefinitely." You were trapped. You couldn't fight him, and you couldn't move. Thinking faster than you ever had before, you feigned agreement. "A fair deal," you conceded. "But before you go, could you just take it back for one moment? This cloak is bunching up, and I'd like to place a pad on my shoulders to make it more comfortable." The Titan, not known for his intellect and eager to be on his way, foolishly agreed. He set down the apples and hoisted the sky back onto his own shoulders. The instant you were free, you scooped up the apples, gave him a polite nod of thanks, and simply walked away, leaving the duped Titan roaring in frustration. You had completed your most complex labor yet, not just with strength, but with a piece of beautifully simple, cosmic trickery. Your final labor, and arguably the most terrifying, was to bring Cerberus, the three-headed dog guarding the underworld, to Eurystheus. Hades agreed, on the condition that you subdue the beast without any weapons. You wrestled the monstrous hound into submission with your bare hands, and dragged it, barking and drooling, all the way to Mycenae. Eurystheus, as expected, promptly hid, and then begged you to return it. It was the most extreme fetch game in history, ending with a very relieved Lord of the Dead. For his grand finale, Eurystheus had finally run out of places on the mortal plane to send you. There was only one destination left from which he could be reasonably certain you would not return: the underworld itself. His 12th and final command was for you to descend into the realm of the dead and bring back its guardian, the monstrous three-headed hound, Cerberus. It was less a labor and more a divinely sanctioned death sentence. He wasn't just moving the goalposts, he was placing them in an entirely different dimension. As a living mortal, you couldn't just wander into the land of the dead. You first had to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, a series of secret religious rites that purified you and gave you the spiritual clearance to cross the threshold between life and death, and crucially, come back. With the goddesses Athena and Persephone acting as your sponsors, and the god Hermes as your guide, you found a dark cavern at Taenarum that served as an entrance. The descent was quiet and cold. The familiar warmth of the sun vanished, replaced by a permanent, shadowless twilight. The air grew still, and the only sounds were the faint, dry whispers of the shades of the dead, as they drifted past you like smoke. You journeyed through the pale, ghostly fields of Asphodel until you reached the throne of Hades. The Lord of the Dead sat on his dark throne beside his queen, Persephone. He was not a demon, but a grim, serious monarch. And this was not a battle, but a negotiation. You showed the king of the underworld the proper respect. You didn't demand his dog. You explained your situation and politely asked if you could borrow it to complete your final labor. It was a formal request for an interdepartmental loan of a major security asset. Hades, perhaps amused by the sheer audacity of the request, agreed on one condition. You could take Cerberus only if you could overpower him with your bare hands. No weapons allowed. You approached the great beast at the gates of hell. Cerberus was a terrifying sight, with 3 snarling heads, a mane woven from living, hissing snakes, and the tail of a dragon. Its thunderous bark was the sound of despair itself. As it lunged, you met it head-on, your impenetrable Nemean lion skin protecting you from its fangs. This was the ultimate test of your strength. You wrapped your arms around the creature's 3 necks, locking it in an unbreakable chokehold. The beast writhed and thrashed, its 3 heads snapping wildly, but it was no match for your power. With a final, desperate whimper, the guardian of the underworld went limp, subdued for the first time in its immortal existence. The journey back to the surface was surreal. You emerged into the sunlight, dragging the dazed and miserable hound of hell behind you. You then marched all the way to Mycenae and presented the creature to Eurystheus. At the sight of the very real, very angry, 3-headed monster drooling venom on his palace floor, the king let out a terrified scream and for the final time dove into his bronze safety jar. He begged you, from within his pot, to take the dreadful thing away and never bring it back. The labor was complete. You dutifully dragged the very confused dog all the way back to the underworld and returned him to his post. A grateful Hades tipped his hat, and with that, your 12 labors, the most grueling and bizarre performance review in history, were finally over. With the 12 labors complete, you were finally free from Eurystheus's service. But freedom for Hercules rarely meant peace and quiet. It usually just meant a new set of problems, often involving more monsters, more irate gods, and more regrettable life choices. It was less a happily ever after, and more a to be continued, with considerably higher stakes. For the first time in over a decade, you were your own man. The weight of your penance was lifted, your name was cleared, and your reputation as the greatest hero in the world was cemented. But after years of having your life dictated by a series of impossible, life-threatening tasks, you were now faced with a far more daunting challenge. What to do next? You were, for all intents and purposes, unemployed. You embarked on what might be called a divine gap year, wandering through the cities of Greece, a living legend with no clear purpose. The structure of the labors was gone, and in its place was a dangerous amount of free time for a man of your immense power and famously short temper. Eventually, you decided to try and recapture the domestic life you had lost. You heard that King Eurytus of Oechalia, the man who had once taught you archery, was offering the hand of his daughter, the beautiful Princess Iole, to anyone who could defeat him and his sons in an archery contest. For you, this was less a challenge and more a formality. You traveled to Oechalia, picked up your bow, and proceeded to effortlessly outshoot your old teacher and his entire family. You had won the contest, and by its terms, the princess. King Eurytus, however, suddenly had second thoughts. He remembered the tragic story of your first wife, Megara, and her children. While you had been purified of the crime, the king couldn't shake the image of what your divine rage, fueled by Hera's curse, was capable of. Looking at you, he saw not a heroic son-in-law, but a colossal liability. Fearing for his daughter's safety, he went back on his word and refused you the marriage. You, feeling deeply insulted and publicly humiliated, stormed away from the kingdom, a familiar, dangerous anger simmering within you. Not long after, some of the king's prized horses were stolen. Eurytus and his sons immediately suspected you, but one son, Iphitus, who considered you a friend, defended your honor. Believing you innocent, Iphitus traveled to your fortress at Tiryns to ask for your help in finding the real thieves. He came to you as a guest and a friend, trusting in your bond and your heroic nature to help him solve the mystery. He walked into your home, a bastion of goodwill in a sea of suspicion. What happened next was another catastrophic failure of your self-control. As you stood with Iphitus atop the high walls of your citadel, your simmering resentment towards his father boiled over into a sudden, violent madness. Some say Hera's influence once again clouded your mind, while others say it was simply your own untamable fury. You turned on your friend, wildly accusing him of plotting to frame you. Before the horrified Iphitus could even defend himself, you seized him and threw him from the citadel walls to his death. You had murdered your friend and broken the sacred law of hospitality in a single, impulsive act. This time, there was no divine madness to blame. The crime was yours. As punishment, a wasting sickness took hold of your body, and you knew you had to seek purification once more. The oracle at Delphi informed you that to atone for this cold-blooded murder, you must be sold into slavery for 3 years, with the price of your sale given to the family of the man you had killed. Your new chapter of freedom had ended abruptly, leading you right back to servitude, this time as the property of Omphale, the queen of Lydia. While traveling with your new wife, Deianira, you encountered the centaur Nessus, who offered to ferry her across a river. Nessus, however, had less than honorable intentions and tried to abduct her. You shot him with a poisoned arrow. As he lay dying, Nessus tricked Deianira into taking some of his blood, claiming it was a love potion. It was the ancient world's most insidious breakup strategy, a dying man's final, venomous prank. After years of servitude and wandering, you had finally found a measure of peace. You had traveled to Caledon and won the hand of the princess, Deianira, in a spectacular wrestling match against her other suitor, the shape-shifting river god, Hercules. With your new bride at your side, you began the long journey home to Tiryns. For a brief, hopeful period, your life resembled something approaching normal. The road was quiet, the landscape was beautiful, and the future seemed, for once, uncomplicated. This tranquility, however, was not destined to last. Your journey was interrupted at the banks of the Evernus River. A recent storm had turned it into a churning, impassable torrent, far too dangerous for Deianira to cross unaided. As you contemplated your options, a large centaur named Nessus emerged from the forest. He introduced himself as the official ferryman of the river, appointed by the gods, he claimed, to help travelers in need. He offered to carry Deianira across on his strong back for a small fee. Wary but seeing little choice, you agreed. You, a powerful swimmer, decided to cross on your own, tossing your famous bow and quiver of poisoned arrows to the other side first, before plunging into the current. You reached the far bank, just in time to see Nessus emerge from the water with Deianira. But the moment his hooves touched dry land, his chivalrous facade vanished. He threw your terrified wife to the ground and attempted to assault her. Her scream of terror echoed across the roaring river. There was no time to swim back. Without a moment's hesitation, you snatched up your bow, nocked an arrow, and took aim. It was a difficult shot across a wide, raging river, but your aim was true. The arrow, its tip coated in the incurable venom of the Lernaean Hydra, flew across the water and buried itself deep in the centaur's chest. Nessus collapsed, the Hydra's poison already burning through his veins. He knew he had only moments to live, and in that time, he concocted a brilliant and terrible revenge. As Deianira, shaken but safe, stood near him, he beckoned her closer. With his dying breaths, he feigned remorse and offered her a secret gift. He told her that the blood from his wound, now mixed with the potent venom from your arrow, would create a powerful love potion. "Take this," he whispered, urging her to collect the dark, toxic blood. "If you ever fear that Hercules' love is straying, secretly anoint his clothing with this charm, and his heart will be bound to you, and only you, forever." It was a masterful deception, preying on Deianira's deepest insecurities. She was a mortal princess, married to the most powerful, most famous, and most desired demigod in the world, a man with a well-known history of infidelity. The promise of a magical insurance policy for his loyalty was too tempting to resist. While you were still making your way back across the river, she secretly scooped some of the poisoned blood into a vial and hid it away, believing she now possessed a failsafe to protect her marriage. Nessus died with a triumphant, malicious smile. The immediate danger was over, but the centaur's final venomous gift was now a ticking time bomb, waiting patiently for the first spark of jealousy to set it off. Later, you fell in love with Iole, which understandably displeased Deianira. Remembering Nessus's love potion, she smeared your ceremonial robe with the centaur's blood and sent it to you. When you put on the robe, the Hydra poison in the blood began to burn your flesh, clinging to you inextricably. It was the ultimate wardrobe malfunction, a garment designed to bring you both love and a slow, agonizing death. Years had passed since the incident at the river, and the vial containing the centaur's gift had sat hidden away, a dark and forgotten secret. Your life, as usual, had been filled with more adventures and conflicts. Chief among them was your lingering, bitter grudge against King Eurytus, the man who had promised you his daughter Iole's hand in marriage and then refused you. Finally, you decided to settle the score. You raised an army, marched on his city of Oechalia, and in a brutal, decisive battle, you conquered the kingdom, killed the king and his sons, and took the now orphaned Iole as your prize. Victorious, you made your way to a cape on the island of Euboea to prepare a grand sacrifice to your father, Zeus. Covered in the grime of your conquest, you desired a fresh set of clothes for the ceremony. You dispatched your loyal herald, Lycus, back to your home in Trachis with simple instructions to inform your wife, Deianira, of your great victory and your imminent return, and to fetch a clean, white robe suitable for a sacrifice. It was a mundane request, the kind a husband sends home after a long and particularly difficult business trip. Lycus set off, leading a train of captives from the fallen city, including the beautiful Iole. Back in Trachis, Deianira was at first overjoyed to hear the news of your success, but her joy turned to ash when she saw the procession of captives, and the herald Lycus pointed out the young, royal, and stunningly beautiful Iole. He explained, perhaps too candidly, that your desire for this woman was the real reason you had leveled an entire city. In that moment, Deianira saw her deepest fears made manifest. She was an aging queen, and you, her famously unfaithful husband, had just brought home her replacement. In a panic, her mind flew to the desperate solution she had kept in reserve for all these years: the centaur's love potion. Believing she was acting to save her marriage, Deianira retrieved the vial. Inside, the centaur's blood and the Hydra's venom had congealed into a dark, viscous paste. In the privacy of her chambers, she carefully smeared the toxic substance onto your finest ceremonial robe, a beautiful tunic of white linen. She was not trying to harm you. In her tragically mistaken mind, she was performing a sacred act of binding magic, ensuring your heart would return to her. She folded the poisoned garment, placed it in a chest, and handed it to the unsuspecting Lycus with one final curious instruction: make sure no sunlight touches the robe until the moment you put it on. Lycus returned to you by the roaring sacrificial fires. You took the robe, pleased with its clean, fresh appearance, and put it on. At first, there was nothing but the feel of soft linen against your skin. But as you stood before the great altar, the warmth from the flames began to heat the fabric. A strange, damp sensation spread across your back and shoulders as the toxic unguent melted, not just onto you, but into you, fusing the cloth to your skin like a second parasitic hide. Then the burning began. It was a slow, creeping fire at first, which quickly escalated into a white-hot, all-consuming agony. The ancient venom of the Hydra, dormant for years, was now alive and actively devouring your flesh. You roared in pain, a sound that shook the very foundations of the island, and tried to tear the cursed garment from your body. But it was useless. The robe was fused to you, and every attempt to rip it away tore off strips of your own skin and muscle, revealing the raw flesh and bone beneath. In your pain-maddened delirium, you saw the innocent herald Lycus, the man who had delivered this torment. Blaming him for your agony, you seized him by the feet, and with a final, furious display of your fading strength, hurled him into the sea. The centaur's long-dormant prank had finally landed, and you, the invincible hero, were being unmade by a piece of poisoned laundry. Racked with unbearable pain from the poisoned robe, you knew your end was near. You ordered a funeral pyre to be built on Mount Oeta, and ascended it, still alive. No one initially dared to light it, until your friend Philoctetes eventually agreed. It was less a quiet passing, and more a spectacular, agonizing self-immolation, ending your mortal life in a blaze of glory and agony. The agony was absolute. The Hydra's venom, delivered by a piece of fine linen, was doing what no monster, giant, or god had ever managed. It was unmaking you. Your legendary strength was useless against the torment that consumed your flesh. Realizing there was no cure, and that a slow, undignified death was the only alternative, you decided to orchestrate your own exit. You commanded your followers to carry you to the summit of Mount Oeta, a place sacred to your father, Zeus. The journey up the rugged mountain path was a slow, solemn procession. The air grew cool and thin, and the sounds of the mortal world faded below, as you retreated from a life that was now nothing but pain. At the windswept summit, you put your final affairs in order. You called your weeping son, Hyllus, to your side, and made him swear a solemn oath that he would take as his wife the very woman who was the cause of all this, Iole of Uchelia. It was your last problematic act of control, ensuring the prize you had fought and died for would remain within your lineage. Then, you gave the instructions for the pyre. Your followers felled mighty oaks and fragrant pines, stacking the logs into a great altar-like structure. It was less a funeral pyre and more a launch pad. With the pyre built, you climbed atop it, the burning remnants of the robe still fused to your body. You laid down your great club and your Nemean lion skin, the symbols of your heroic life. You were ready. But as you looked down at the faces of your loyal companions, you were met with horror and inaction. You commanded them to light the pyre, to release you from your suffering. No one moved. Your own son, bound by love and grief, refused. Your friends averted their gaze. They could not bring themselves to perform the terrible act of setting their living hero on fire. It was the ultimate, most terrible favor to ask, and you were left in agonizing limbo on a pile of kindling. As your pained roars echoed across the mountain, a shepherd named Philoctetes was drawn to the scene. Seeing your hopeless, excruciating state, he alone seemed to understand that the act was one of mercy, not murder. You saw the pity in his eyes and made him an offer. For this one final service, you would give him your most prized possessions, your great bow, a weapon that never missed, and your quiver of arrows still tipped with the fatal venom of the Hydra. It was the ultimate inheritance, a legendary weapon system bequeathed as payment for a compassionate, if horrific, act. Philoctetes, understanding the weight of the gift and the necessity of the task, accepted. He took a torch and, turning his face away, thrust it into the base of the pyre. The dry wood caught slowly at first, with a hiss and a crackle, before erupting into a roaring inferno. As the flames engulfed you, consuming your mortal flesh and the last vestiges of the poison, the sky itself seemed to break open. A great thunderclap sounded from a cloudless sky. A dark, swirling cloud descended from the peak of Mount Olympus, enveloping the pyre in a shroud of lightning and shadow. When the cloud finally lifted and the fire died down, your followers approached the smoldering ashes. There were no bones, no weapons, no trace of your mortal body. The fire had purified you, burning away everything human, and your divine essence, the immortal son of Zeus, had been called home. As your mortal body burned, your immortal essence, your godliness, separated and ascended to Mount Olympus. Zeus welcomed you, and Hera, finally letting go of her grudge, adopted you and even gave you her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth, as your new wife. It was the ultimate career progression, from troubled demigod with a terrible temper to a full-fledged deity, with all the perks and none of the pesky mortal coil. The ascent itself was a release, the all-consuming agony of the poison, the crushing weight of your labors, the deep scars of grief and regret. All of it dissolved as the fire purified your mortal half. What remained was the pure, divine spark of your father, Zeus. You rose with the storm cloud he had sent for you, a weightless spirit traveling through the vast expanse of the cosmos. Below you, the world of mortals, the stage for your long and painful drama, shrank to a tiny, distant sphere. You passed the stars and constellations, some of which bore the marks of your own adventures, on your final journey home. You arrived on Olympus not as a petitioner or a guest, but as a long-awaited son. The great bronze gates swung open, and you were met by the entire pantheon. The air in the divine halls was thick with the scent of ambrosia and the ethereal music of Apollo's lyre. Athena and Hermes, who had guided you through so many of your trials, greeted you with knowing smiles. Your father, Zeus, embraced you, his face filled with a pride that had, for your entire mortal life, been a source of both blessing and curse. This was your official welcome, the end of a probationary period that had lasted a lifetime. The most critical part of your orientation, however, was the final reconciliation with your lifelong antagonist. Zeus led you before the throne of Hera. For a moment, the celestial music may have faltered as every god watched, waiting to see how this cosmic feud would finally end. But the Hera who met your gaze was not the vengeful, scheming goddess who had tormented you on earth. With your mortal form, the living embodiment of her husband's infidelity, now gone, her ancient grudge had finally been extinguished. In a grand, symbolic gesture of peace, she performed a divine ritual, formally adopting you as her own son. It was the most surreal and conclusive act of forgiveness, a celestial HR decision designed to restore harmony to the dysfunctional Olympian family. With Hera's blessing, your place as a god was secure, and as a final, undeniable seal on your new status, she offered you the hand of her own beloved daughter, Hebe. You, the hero whose life had been a testament to toil and suffering, were to be married to the goddess of eternal youth and vitality. Your wedding feast was the ultimate divine celebration, a cosmic retirement party attended by the entire pantheon. You drank the nectar of the gods and ate the ambrosia that solidified your immortality. The pain, the madness, the labors, all were now just stories from a former life. Yet, in a strange and fitting paradox, a part of you never truly left the world of suffering. The ancient Greeks believed that while your divine self, the mighty Hercules, now feasted in the golden halls of Olympus, an echo of your mortal life remained. A phantom shade of you, still cloaked in your lion skin and carrying your great bow, was said to roam the melancholy fields of asphodel in the underworld. This shade, when encountered by other heroes, would speak of the endless toil of his life on earth. It was the perfect poignant end to your story. Your divine spirit found eternal peace, but the memory of your human pain was so profound that its ghost lingered forever in the realm of the dead. Now, as a god, you reside on Olympus, a respected figure, forever youthful alongside Hebe. Your mortal troubles are behind you, replaced by the eternal banquets, divine politics, and occasional squabbles that define godly existence. You're less of a monster slayer and more of a celestial retiree, enjoying endless ambrosia and nectar, probably still reminiscing about the good old days when life was simpler, and your biggest worry was a three-headed dog. It's the ultimate happily ever after, if you consider an eternity of divine bureaucracy and family drama happy. Your new existence is one of serene, timeless leisure. You lounge on clouds that feel softer than any earthly linen, your wife Hebe at your side, ensuring the nectar in your cup is never empty. The constant, grinding pain of your mortal life has been replaced by an eternal, blissful ease. You have a new official role, too. After a lifetime of forcing your way into and out of heavily guarded locations, you have been appointed the guardian of the gates of Olympus. It's a fitting, deeply ironic promotion, moving from the world's most troublesome intruder to its most formidable bouncer. You spend your days watching the cosmos turn, a silent, powerful sentinel at the threshold of the gods. Down below, in the mortal world, your legacy has transformed you into an immortal influencer. Temples rise in your name, their white marble gleaming in the sun. Mortals, when faced with impossible tasks or needing a surge of strength, now pray to you. Their hopes and fears are a faint, constant murmur, a stream of data from the world you left behind. You are no longer a tormented hero seeking purification. You are a source of it for others, and your family life has never been more stable. Your father, Zeus, looks upon you with undisguised pride, and your relationship with your new adoptive mother, Hera, is one of quiet, respectful, if slightly awkward, peace. The endless feud is over, replaced by the polite dynamics of a corporate merger that everyone has agreed is for the best. The great adventures of your past have become your go-to stories for the endless Olympian banquets. You sit with Ares and Athena, trading tales of battle and strategy. Your 12 labors, once a sentence of hard labor and near certain death, are now a collection of legendary anecdotes. You can speak of the Nemean lion's hide, the Hydra's regenerating heads, and the sheer audacity of tricking Atlas, all with the detached amusement of a veteran recounting old war stories. From your vantage point among the clouds, you can now watch the struggles of new heroes, the petty squabbles of mortal kings, and the all-too-familiar meddling of your fellow gods, all with a profound, first-hand understanding of what it's like to be a pawn in their great games. And yet, for all your divine peace, a part of you remains forever tied to the world of suffering, while you, the god Hercules, enjoy your eternal reward. The myth of your life is so powerful that a piece of it remains behind. An echo of your mortal self, a phantom shade, still roams the pale, melancholy fields of asphodel. This ghost of you still carries its bow, still wears its lion skin, and still speaks to the shades of other heroes about the endless, wearying toil of its life. It is the perfect, final testament to who you were. A being whose divinity was so great it could ascend to the heavens, but whose human suffering was so profound that its shadow could never truly leave the world of the dead. But here, on the peak of Olympus, that is just a story, a distant memory. Your struggles are over, the monsters are slain, the penance is served, And the final reward is an eternity of peace. Your epic, chaotic, and truly exhausting story is finally at an end. And now, as your tale fades into the quiet of the night, perhaps you too can let your own labors of the day fall away and simply rest. And so, the long, strange, and often deeply unreasonable story of Hercules comes to a close. From the serpents in his crib to the final cleansing fire on Mount Oeta, his life was a relentless series of cosmic hazing rituals. A 12-part job interview from hell, filled with monstrous pest control, divine family drama, and at least one truly catastrophic wardrobe malfunction. His was a life of profound struggle, a testament to a strength that was both a gift and a curse. These ancient stories, for all their absurdity, are tales of incredible endurance. They remind us of a time when the world felt chaotic and unpredictable, governed by forces far beyond mortal understanding. The heroes of myth faced down their monsters, literal and otherwise, with a resilience that is, even now, quietly astonishing. They shouldered the weight of the heavens, descended into the land of the dead, and navigated the petty squabbles of the gods, all as part of a day's work. So as you lie here now, settled and warm in your bed, perhaps take a quiet moment to be grateful. Grateful that your chores for tomorrow don't involve rerouting 2 rivers to clean out a stable that hasn't been touched in 30 years. Grateful that your biggest frustrations don't involve a 9-headed creature that multiplies when you deal with it. And grateful that your path to peace doesn't require a diplomatic negotiation with the goddess of the hunt or a wrestling match with the guard dog of hell. The labors of Hercules are done. And now, your own labors for the day are done too. There are no more monsters to face tonight. No more gods to appease. There is only the gentle, quiet dark, and the promise of rest. Let the chaos of the ancient world fade away, and allow the hero's hard-won peace to become your own. Rest now, and sleep well.